All right, there we go. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. It's 11:04. We got people hopping in. Today is our car forms training. So next week is not car forms. Just so you know, we covered the buyers this last week. We're covering the seller side of things this week. And then next week is October, which means we're going to be diving into our business planning. Okay, we need to put our business plan together for 2025 in October of 2024 so that we can start executing that plan in November and December. It'll cause us to finish the year strong and start out next year on track. If we don't have our business plan in place until January 2025, those closings that we were hoping to have happen in January, they do become just a hope because we didn't put any action into place in November and December to get us to closings in January. So if we develop our business plan in October, then by we're starting to run with that business plan by the end of the year so that we can have the closings starting in January and have a consistent, solid 2025. So that will start next week, same time, same place, but instead of car forms. So this week we have our car forms training. And because Anastasia brought up a fabulous point at the beginning, we're going to start with her question, even though she doesn't know we're circling back to it. And then we'll move on to the residential listing agreement. So again, last week we covered the buyer's forms. We talked about the residential purchase agreement. We talked about the BRBC. Which is the buyer representation and broker compensation. We talked about the PSRA, which is the temporary buyer representation agreement. And we talked about the SPBB, which is how we negotiate our commission. We negotiate our commission on the buyer's behalf with the seller. Okay. And that is in fact what we're doing. Oh, another point that I should make is I'm going to work really hard. It's going to be hard for me because I've been doing this since 2007. Okay. But I'm going to work really hard to move away from calling it commission. Okay. Our professional fee for services, our compensation, that's what it is. Okay. So professional fee for compensation or professional fee for service or compensation. I'm going to work really hard on moving away from that. I'm probably going to have to. I'm not in my office right now, or I would make myself a little sticky note. But instead, I'm going to put a little note here on my grocery list so I see it later. And I remember to update myself to put a sticky on my computer. So professional fee for service or compensation. Okay, so notice it's called buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. It's compensation, it's not commission. Okay, so there is that. All right, so we covered that last week. This week we're going to talk about the listing side of things, but I'm going to open with a form that I don't know that I've actually ever seen before. Maybe I've seen it once, but it's called the Property Visit and Open House Advisory. Anastasia asked a question about open houses. There's a new form that we need if you're going to be hosting an open house to make sure that we have every visitor sign in on that form. This second form here, this form is great because in the listing agreements, it's going to talk about the fact that if there's recording devices present, that we should be posting a sign stating that there may be recording devices. I would say 1% of agents in our market maybe do that, maybe 0.5%. Okay, I'm hesitant to ever say. I think I've seen it once in all of my property showing where somebody had posted that there was recording devices. However, our residential listing agreement says that we should. It actually says the seller should. Okay, but our job is to take the work off the seller's back and take it on and help them. So in doing so, we can provide them this form. I would actually take this top section of the form, 1 through 5. I would maybe get a really cute frame from, Marshalls or Ross or TJ Maxx or Home Goods or whatever you've got near you. And I would fit this into that frame and just put it in every single listing that I had. I'd have multiple copies of it. Hey, this is just part of our listing package. It can kind of go in like your basket with your booties or whatever, right? So that every person that comes in that property can see that recording devices, right? Audio and video recording devices or both may be present on the property that is being visited or viewed. Such devices may be located inside and outside of the main dwelling, right? So, hey, this is good information to have. Visitor safety. Visitors is advised to be aware and watchful of conditions on any property, right? Let's see here. Visitor needs to exercise additional caution, both putting on foot coverings, removing shoes, right? As well as walking around in socks because they may not have adequate traction on smooth surfaces, which could result in slips and falls, right? Visitor safety, animals and pets. They're advised to use caution around animals or pets because they may be a source of allergies or exhibit dangerous or unpredictable behavior. Accompany minors. Visitors are advised to watch any accompanying minors. Visitors responsible for their care, safety, and conduct in the property. And then risk of injury. Upon entering the property, visitor agrees to assume the risk of entering the property. Right? All great things that we should have on all of our properties so that people can see it. I might even, if it were me, the property were for sale, I might even have like command strips or something and put it like beside the door on the exterior before they even enter into the property to make sure that they've seen it. Or someplace like, you know, right as they walk in the door, on the door. We don't want to ruin the paint on the door though, so be careful with those command strips because they do come off. Sometimes they pull off, but a lot of doors, especially exterior doors, they're either wood or metal. And if they're metal, you can do magnets. Okay, just something to think about there. Just some options that you may want to do. And then I would also have this on an open house. So if it's your listing and you already have this posted, you don't have to worry about it. But if you're hosting a open house for somebody else, you may want to take this with you in your cute little frame so that everybody knows what the risks are of entering that property. Okay, so that is an old form. It was created in 2020. I don't think I've ever seen it before, but it's the Property Visit and Open House Advisory, or the PVOH. Okay. Again, main thing here is people are assuming the risk and it's making them aware of recording devices. The second form for open houses specifically is the Open House Visitor Non-Agency Disclosure and Sign-In. So remember last week, if you were on, and if not, if you've been on any of the other trainings or paid attention in the last 3 months, per the NAR settlement agreement, or the National Association of Realtors settlement agreement, everybody who we show a property must have a signed representation form. Again, it might be the full BRBC. It could be the temporary one, which is good only for 30 days or 3 properties. Okay, it's not and, it's or. So it maxes at 3 properties, or it maxes at 30 days if they haven't seen 3 properties. Okay. So one of those 2 forms needs to be signed for every property that we show. Well, the problem comes in open houses. Here we are opening a house and ultimately showing people the property. So we need to have something on record that we do not represent them and we're not acting on their behalf. This is the form that does this. So any open house that you attend, you need to have the visitor sign this. That being said, if you've got buyers that you're working with, I would prep them in advance as part of my buyer consultation, or when we're actively viewing properties. If they're like, oh, yeah, I don't think we have any properties we want to see this weekend, you could prep them in advance and say, hey, just a heads up. If you happen to be passing by a house and there's an open house and you decide to go in, number one, don't feel like you've got to go into the open house. If you call me, we can always schedule a private time for you to view that house. But if you do decide to go to the open house, the agent there should have you do a sign-in. It's required as part of the settlement agreement that was reached with the National Association of Realtors and that lawsuit that happened not too long ago. And they're going to ask you to sign in. It's okay to do so. On that sign-in sheet, it's going to ask if you have an agent. Just write my name in, or here's a stack of extra cards, 5 or 6 extra cards. So if you do happen to pass through an open house, just hand this to the other agent or put it next to your name on that sign-in sheet. That way you have the information. They can contact me directly. You don't even have to put your phone number and email. You can put my phone number and my email on there with your name and me as the agent. Okay, so prep them in advance for this sheet before they even go view properties. Okay, now if we're hosting that open house, we want to have this sheet. It talks about visitor intention to view the property. Agent is holding an open house or conducting in-person or live virtual tours of the property identified above. Visitor is interested in viewing the property. Agent agrees to show property to visitor on the following terms and conditions. Agent does not represent the visitor unless otherwise agreed in writing. That would be on a BRBC or a PSRA. Agent is not working with and has not entered into a representation agreement with visitor that would apply to the property. Communication with agent at the open house, property tour for benefit of the seller. Any communication or sharing of information that the agent has with the visitor during the open house property tour regarding the property is for the benefit of the seller. All acts of the agent of the open house or property tour, even those that assist visitor in deciding whether to make an offer on the property, or for the benefit of the seller exclusively. This is saying, hey, buyers, we have no fiduciary responsibility to you. Our full fiduciary responsibility goes with the seller, which means nothing you say to me right now is confidential. Okay, if we had a duty to that buyer, if we had an agency agreement in place, stuff that the buyer shared with us during that tour would be confidential for the seller. We don't have to share it with the seller, but as an agent of the seller, not an agent of the buyer, any information they give us can go straight to the seller up until that time that they sign a representation agreement. If visitor writes an offer on the property through agent, at that time, agent will disclose if agent or agent's broker represent the seller exclusively or both the seller and the visitor, right? Who are we representing? If visitor wants to be represented by the agent holding the open house, visitor should sign a representation agreement with the agent holding the open house, such as a property showing and representation agreement, that's the PSRA, or the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, the BRBC. If visitor is in an exclusive relationship with another agent, this is not intended as a solicitation of visitor. Okay, so everybody should be signing in. Number one, I have always had everybody sign into my open houses. Why? Because if something went missing from that open house, I want a record of who passed through so I know who to get in contact with to track down my missing items. Okay, I think it's a safety and security issue to not have people sign in. So everybody should sign in. Now notice this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spots. I would not have 7 people sign in on this sign-in sheet. Me personally, I would give 1 sheet to each party that walks through the door for them to fill in with their name, if they have people with them, the people's names, at least 1 email, 1 phone number, and their agent if they're working with one. Okay, the reason for that is me as a visitor, if I'm signing in on a sign-in sheet with 5 or 6 other people that have already signed in, I'm going to be a lot more reluctant to share actual information because I don't want other people seeing my information. Okay, I may not mind sharing it with the agent that's hosting the open house because legally I'm required to, but I don't want to share it with the other 5 people that have already put their name on that form. So I personally would print up a whole bunch of these and have them available on clipboards and hand 1 to each person as they walk through, ask them to sign in before they can view the property. If they don't want to sign in, I would say, I'm sorry, then I can't allow you to see the property. If they become irate and upset and angry, and you feel like your life could be threatened or in danger, or that they might assault you in some way, then I would step outside, let them go ahead and see the property, and I would be on the phone with 911. Okay, I would call the police to come by the property because you technically told them they couldn't come into the property. I'm not going to use my personal body. Anastasia might. I'm not going to block them from coming in the house. Usually telling them they have to sign in or they can't view the house. Usually they'll just turn around and walk away. I've yet to have anybody get irate and angry with me. But if they did, I'm not going to be the one that gets beaten and becomes a news story. I'm going to let them into the property and get on the phone with the police. Okay, it's always a good idea to have the local police emergency number outside of 911 that you can call in the city that you're hosting the open house. Because sometimes, especially when we're calling from our cell phones, the 911 call gets routed to like a CHP dispatch center versus the local police station. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. We never want you to have a situation where you feel like you are in danger. Okay. Also for the safety and security, since we're talking about open houses, I would make sure that we don't host open houses by ourselves. Okay. Invite somebody else to come with you. I don't care if it's a spouse. I don't care if it's your adult child or almost adult child that looks like an adult. I've done that a few times. I don't care if it's another agent, a lender, an insurance person, a home inspector, a pest inspector. Bring somebody along with you. Ideally, me personally, I would say don't invite another agent as your first option. I would invite like a third-party vendor, usually like a lender, to come host that open house with you. The reason being is you're not competing for leads with a lender. They're there to share information with every buyer that passes through that house. They've got something to offer every potential visitor, as do you. And so you guys are working together to solidify some relationships with those visitors. Okay, any questions about the property visitor and visit and open house advisory, or the open house visitor non-agency disclosure and sign-in? All right, crickets. All right, so we'll hop back over to the listing agreement. I'm going to pause for just a brief second, mainly so that Abby can, when she goes in to edit this video, she can break these apart and do like open house document trainings and the RLA training for me, so that they're on two separate trainings. But hold on just a second. Okie dokies. Let's jump in on the residential listing agreement. We're going to talk about, I'm not going to cover this in detail on each and every little item, but I am going to cover some of the major changes that happened in July and talk about what that means for you and moving forward, and how to make sure that we complete this appropriately and accurately, and how we have conversations with other agents appropriately and accurately. So disclosure regarding agency relationship is exactly the same. No changes there. And then these are the forms. The good news is, so remember the listing agreement and the purchase agreement used to have like 20 forms before you ever got to the listing agreement. Okay. They're no longer there at the beginning, which brings me joy and happiness. Agency disclosure should always be first. Okay. But then it goes straight into the listing agreement. Same thing with the purchase agreement. And then all those extra forms, don't worry, they're still there, but they're at the end now. So if we scroll to the end of the listing agreement, which is 7 pages, we've got a new form that we're going to talk about, the MLSA, which is 2 pages. And then you've got that seller's advisory, which has always been there after the listing agreement. We've got the broker's compensation advisory, which again is a new form. So we'll probably touch on that one as well. We've got the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent, which used to be at the beginning. Okay, so it's still there, but it's at the end now. We've got the fair housing and discrimination advisory, again, still there, but now at the end. And we've got the California Consumer Privacy Act disclosure and notice, still there at the end now. No changes there. We've got the property visit and open house advisory. Oh, look, it's even in here now. No, sorry. It's because I jumped to the next document. It's not there. I was like, wait, now it's magically appearing. No. So it ends at the California Consumer Privacy Act advisory is the end of the listing agreement. So those forms that used to be at the beginning are now at the end. So we just have agency disclosure, and then it jumps right into that listing agreement. So thank you, Car Forms, for doing that for us. I think that works a lot better. Keep in mind too, that I also like to include with my listing agreement, the market conditions advisory. I put that, when I put it in for signatures, I put that ahead of my listing agreement, because ultimately the market conditions advisory states that the market's cyclical, there's ups and downs, and ultimately the seller is responsible for choosing the price at which we're going to list their property. Okay, so it doesn't make sense to show them that advisory after the listing agreement. We like to do it before. And then the disclosure information advisory, I like to include that with my listing agreement, because it talks about all the things that the seller needs to disclose. That one can go after the listing agreement if you would like. And the other one that I always include with my listing agreement, and my purchases for that matter, the market conditions advisory, I also include with all my purchases. The other one is the SBSA. I include with both purchase and sale transactions, or purchase and listings. And that one just makes everybody aware of their duties in the transaction, and makes the seller aware of the 37 different ways. I don't know how many there really are on the SBSA, but all the different ways a buyer may want to inspect the property, all the different types of inspections out there. So again, I think that's one that should be presented up front, not at the end of the transaction. So there's my little side note. All right, so the listing agreements, top section remains unchanged. We're gonna fill that out. I've got lots of videos on how to do that. I've covered this form in detail. Make sure you fill it out completely. It's gonna ask up here for the address. When we do the address, we want the number, the street, and make sure you put that suffix at the end of the street, right? The drive, street, avenue, way, court, whatever it might be, because, and oftentimes there might be a sample street as well as a sample court with the same numbers. Okay, so it can get confusing really fast if we don't put that suffix. And then also don't forget the parcel number. If you don't know the parcel number for the property, there's a few ways to look at that. You can always ask your title rep to pull it up for you or give you access to their online system where you can usually pull up tax records. You can also go to the county tax records to get that APN. Or the other option is if the house has previously been listed, you go into the MLS, pull in that property address, it'll pull up the previous listing. That will have the APN on it as well. So lots of different ways to capture that APN number. All right, here the listing period, this is where we're going to put, well, number one change that happened in July is they moved it, well, technically, I think this happened in June. No, it may have been July. They moved it to a grid format to match the residential purchase agreement. Again, thank you, Car Forms, for making our life easier. I really appreciate that. So now it's in the grid, which means everything that we need to fill in on this listing agreement's on like the first 2 pages. Okay, the rest of the 7 pages is the signatures and then all the information here. So this is section 2. The whole grid is section 2. So this would be 2A1. This would be 2A2 would be the listing price. 2B would be property specific listings. 2C would be compensation, right? So that's how that works there. That first letter that you see, the letter and number references where it's at in this grid. The second letter that you see here, so like 2A1, see here it says 4G. If we want to know about the listing period and the maximum length of a listing period, that's the paragraph. So we would scroll down to 4G, EFG, maximum listing period. That's where you'd find the details for that item in the listing agreement. So that's how this grid works on both this, the residential purchase agreement, and the BRBC, which are all grid formats. Okay. Property specific listing, if it was manufactured or probate, conservatorship, or guardianship, it would go there. Manufactured, you check that box. It's going to add an additional addendum to your document. If I check it, notice here it gets a little squirrely thing, and it's going to add that form automatically to my list. So now as I look at the list on the right-hand side of the page, it's got the manufactured home listing addendum. So know that it'll add those forms automatically. If I uncheck the box, it does not take that form away though. Okay. So just a heads up on that. All right. So compensation to seller's broker. Notice it doesn't say commission. Wah, wah, wah. All right. So compensation. Okay. Now here's the major change that happened in July. Okay. For new agents, this is not going to be an issue because you're just going to learn it the right way. For us old agents that have been doing it one way forever, where there's always been cooperating broker compensation, we're no longer doing that. So compensation to the seller's broker. Okay, that's just how much am I going to get paid for selling your house for you for the most amount of money with the least amount of hassle on your terms. Okay, what am I going to get paid for doing that for you? We're going to put in a percentage there, or you can put in a percentage and a flat amount. So it might be X percent plus maybe the amount of the transaction fee. Maybe you want the full commission, they're going to pay the transaction fee. Okay. Right? So you can put a flat amount there. So that would be percent and, okay, this next box that says, or with a checkbox. If we put a checkbox there, this percentage and the first flat rate, they don't apply any longer. It's just whatever we fill in this line is going to be the commission, or sorry, the compensation received for selling this property. Okay, so you've got a percent, you've got a percent and, or you've got an or, which is just a flat rate. The other option is that we could say, hey, we want to do a compensation schedule. See attached compensation schedule. Okay. Why would you use a compensation schedule? There could be 150 different reasons why you could, but the easiest one to say, hey, this might be something you want to think about is maybe you're like, hey, homes up to 300,000, I expect a flat rate of this, right? Because, you know, if you're like, man, X percent of 100,000 isn't very much, and I want to make at least a minimum of Y for doing all the work, because just because it's listed at 100,000 doesn't make it any less work than the house that's listed at 700,000, right? So maybe you want to make more than what your normal percentage would be. So you would you could do a flat rate on that compensation schedule, and then you could say, hey, for any homes that are between 300,000 and 700,000, I expect this. And for any homes that are, you know, 700 and 1,000 to whatever, to 3 million, I expect Y. Okay, so you might have a graduated compensation schedule, or your compensation schedule may be, hey, if I sell it at the list price that you want, what we agree on would be market value, I get X. And if we bring in multiple offers and I sell above what we've decided to list the house at, I get an additional amount of compensation of Y, right? So you may go that route as well. So there's so many ways that you could use a compensation schedule. Again, compensation is not fixed, okay? It's negotiable, and you can determine what you want to ask for your services and what the value that you bring. So that section there is how you fill that out. So again, compensation, it's only for what's getting paid to you. Okay, C2 is also getting confused a lot. So this is 2C2. This is additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer's unrepresented. Okay, so if you have a buyer call you up and say, hey, I want to submit an offer on your listing, and you're like, great, would you like me to draw that up for you? They're like, nope, that's okay. I don't need an agent. I can draw up my own offer. I'm going to submit it over to you. I'm not going to be represented in this transaction. I'm not going to work with an agent. You'd be like, that's fantastic. No problem. You're stupid, but that's all right. I'm joking. But, you know, like investors and stuff, they may not have an agent. Okay. So this would be if the buyer is unrepresented. Here's the reality to that situation. You're going to end up doing more work because they aren't represented, and there's forms and stuff that you're going to need. You're going to need them to take care of. You may be sending stuff in a DocuSign for them, whatever it might be. You may not be representing them in an agent capacity, but still, we're going to have to help them hobble through this transaction, which is going to create some more work for me. I don't have an agent on the other side assisting to get this transaction closed. So that's what C2 is for. If the buyer is unrepresented, is there an additional amount of compensation that you're going to receive from the seller because the agent isn't, or the buyer is not represented by an agent, because I'm going to have to do more work. Okay.
So should we make the habit of putting something there or leaving it blank? What is your recommendation?
My recommendation is if you feel that you're going to be due additional compensation if that situation arises, then I would absolutely make it a habit of checking this box here and filling in something on this line, whether it be a flat rate, whether it be a compensation, whether it be an additional percentage, a 0.5%, whatever it might be. I would be in the habit of filling that out if that would be your expectation. Absolutely. This is not something that I would try to renegotiate in the instance that a buyer comes in that is not represented. And you can even have this conversation with your seller up front as we're going through this listing agreement, right? Here's the compensation. And in the case that the buyer's not represented, which means that I'm going to have to be providing them additional forms. I'm not going to represent them, which means anything they tell me, I can tell straight to you because there's no fiduciary responsibility. There's no confidentiality, but I'm still going to be doing additional work. And in order for me to do that, I'm going to expect an additional percentage or additional amount for that buyer. Now, seller, in my 5 years of real estate experience, or my 23 years of real estate experience, the number of times I've worked with a seller with an unrepresented buyer has happened never, right? Or it has happened once, right? So you can let them know how frequent that is, so the opportunity of that happening, but that you're just, a CYA type situation here. Make sense? Okay. Continuation right to compensation for broker identified prospective buyers. The continuation period should be blank calendar days after the listing period or any extension thereof, right? So this is just saying that, hey, if prospective buyers that have passed through the house, whether I represent them or not, and they choose to write an offer on your house after the listing period ends, I'm still due the compensation because they saw it during the listing period. That's what this continuation of right for compensation. Now let's go look at 4D2, just because I want to see if this one clarifies like the buyer representation did. Here's compensation terms, continuation rights. If during the continuation period specified in 2C23 or the same period after any cancellation of this agreement, unless otherwise agreed, seller enters into contract to sell lease. So this handles it in case it is canceled specifically. Okay. So keep that in mind. This is for cancellation. If the seller says, hey, I no longer want to sell my house, please pull it off the market. You're going to say, hey, no problem. Here's a list of potential buyers that saw the property. This prevents the seller from canceling the listing agreement, turning right back around and accepting an offer from a buyer who saw the house during that listing period, and then you not getting paid for it. That is the heart behind this continuation right. So I would absolutely fill something in there, whether it be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever you want to put in there, that continuation period. On the buyer representation agreement, the continuation period specifies it's after it expires, I believe, not after cancellation. So you have to handle that inside of the cancellation form as far as if it's canceled. Seller's obligation to pay previous brokers. This was in the previous listing agreement. This is if they had a previous listing agreement with somebody else, they've canceled it. Now they're trying to list the property with you. This would be if they have any obligation to pay anybody else for any other potential buyers. That way you have that information up front. Items included and excluded, same as the other one, but keep in mind, there's lots of little blanks there that you can fill in. So, items included would be things that are, you don't have to cover like fixtures, right? So things that are attached to the property that would normally sell with the property, we don't have to fill them in here. This would just be additional items. Like maybe I want to include the fridge, or maybe I want to include the washer and dryer, or maybe there's some decorative shelving hanging up that I'd prefer not to have to pull off the wall and patch those holes. Or maybe there's a shed out back and it's not actually attached to the ground, but I'd like to leave it behind, right? So those type of things might be included. Or maybe they've got a bunch of potted plants and they're just saying, hey, we don't want to move the potted plants because technically potted plants aren't included. Maybe they want to leave them. So things like that. Excluded items. So if there's something, again, these aren't like your normal, like, oh, I'm going to take my couch with me. These are things that are, hey, this thing would normally be considered a fixture or maybe seen as a fixture. Like, oh, my curtains are now fixtures, right? So they're supposed to stay with the property, but maybe they want to take the curtains with them. You would fill that item out in the excluded items. Or maybe there's a chandelier that has personal sentimental value. You're going to put that in the excluded items. And then I always advise my sellers, if there's something they don't want to include that should be included, like a chandelier, and they want to take it down, to please take it down before we actually go live on the market and replace it with something else. That way buyers don't get their heart set on that beautiful chandelier. That's the reason they wrote the offer. And then we break their heart with a counter offer saying the chandelier is not included. Okay. So a lot of those things I'll try to tell them
fancy
ahead of time.
What's going on with that?
Had radishes I wanted to eat and share. And that's all the ranch I could get out, so we're having the Gerards on top. So,
I can mute
and
her.
ranch is on the list.
I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can do that. Oh, aha. Hey, Deborah, can you mute yourself for me, please? Oh, there we go. Perfect. All right. So items included and excluded. Next item is leased items. Leased items and liened items are D3 and D4. Things like propane tanks, solar power systems, water softeners, alarm systems. Liened items would be things. So the difference between leased and liened, right? Leased is I have a propane tank on my property. The propane company owns that tank still, but they let me use that tank as long as they're the ones filling it up. Okay, I don't own it. It's not staying with the property. If I stop using their service, it goes away. Or it might be a leased item, might be an alarm system. It's still owned by the alarm company. I either pay for it monthly, like some solars are leased versus lien. But I'll never actually own it. Right? So at some point, if I cancel the service, if I no longer want it, they'll come and take it away. Okay. That's a leased item. A liened item is, oh my gosh, I didn't have enough money for my heating and air conditioning. So they financed it and they recorded it against the title to the property. That would be a lien, something recorded against the title of the property. Okay. So oftentimes we see that with heating and air conditioning systems. We see that with windows. We see that with solar power systems, right? Solar. If somebody owns the solar system, but they haven't paid for it in full, it's going to be a lien against the property. D5 is smart home features seller prefers to include, and smart home features that seller prefers to exclude. So if there are smart outlets, if there's a smart thermostat, right? All those things in there. E1 is property will be marketed in the following MLSs, primary and other. This is going to be most of the information that we used to see in the listing agreement that the seller had to make choices on is now going to be in the MLSA. But here's where you would put your MLSs. Keep in mind that Realty One Group is members of multiple MLSs. You could reach out to Melina probably knows all the different MLSs, or Ed or Kara would know as well that we belong to, because it may be in your best interest to say that, hey, our primary is Barry's Plus, but we also belong to East Bay and Contra Costa and Metrolist and I don't know what other ones, right? So you could fill those in. Yuba, I don't remember, Yuba Sutter, I think is one, right? So you might want to fill those in because then now you look fancy because you're like, look, I belong to 7 MLSs. What did the other agent belong to, right? Could be part of your listing agreement, part of the value that you bring. They don't have to know that Barry's Plus posts in 7 different MLSs either, right? You could just say, hey, when I put your listing in the MLS, it shows up in MLSs in 23 counties. I don't know how many it actually is, but you'd have to look and see, right? So you could like use your leverage that way to share your value, just throwing some things out there. Here is E2, seller instructs broker to not take or use photographs in marketing except as required by MLS rules. Keep in mind, MLS requires 1 photo of the front of the property. So if they don't want photos taken for whatever reason, we would check that box there. Timing of presentation of offers is F1. That's when are we reviewing offers. If we leave it at the default with nothing checked there, then they're going to be reviewed as they're received or as soon as practical, right? If we have an offer review date, like I like to put my properties on the market on Wednesday or Thursday and leave it on the market for like a full week so that people have the right to see it and have the ability to make sure they have time to see it. It keeps me from having random showing requests at like 5 in the morning or 6 or like 9 o'clock at night. Then you could put your offer review date and time here. And you could go, hey, it's going to be 7 days or 6 days after the property is listed active, or you could put a specific date in there. You've got 2 options. Here's any investigation reports that you're going to have done, your pre-listing inspections, natural hazard zone disclosures, always checked. And then you might want to check like preliminary title report. Now notice that it says seller shall order and pay for any report selected within 5 days or at the beginning date of this agreement. The NHD is usually paid for by the seller, but it doesn't have to be paid until the close of escrow. The preliminary title report, there's no cost for that one. So you may down here on additional terms put, there's no cost for the NHD or the preliminary title report. Or sometimes, like I have a clause in here, I think that's listing photos and inspections. It just says agent to credit seller the cost of professional photos and any pre-listing inspections at close of escrow, right? I'm going to cover the cost of those at the close of escrow for them. They're going to pay for them up front. I'm going to credit it back to them. That way, I don't have to worry about if the property doesn't close or the seller pull it off market, getting that money back from the sellers as a cancellation or whatever you want to do. So that might be, or you might want to say there's, just as a blanket here, no cost to prelim and NHD report upfront, no upfront fee for NHD and preliminary title report, right? So it's just something in there like that. Seller opt-outs is, let's see here, ownership and title. exceptions to? Is there any exceptions to their ownership or title? Seller intends to include a contingency to purchase replacement property as part of this transaction. That would be the SPRP, right? They're going to sell their home to buy another one. And if they don't buy another one, they don't want their home sold. That would be that contingency. Seller opt-outs of either the key safe lockbox or signs. Keep in mind that we want to leverage those listings for additional leads. My computer is dying. Hold on just a second. I got to go find a cord. So we want to leverage those listings for additional leads. So that means that we want that sign in the yard so that people know who it is that's selling that property, and they will call us off that sign so we can get leads from those sign calls. So it's really important, I think, to make sure you have a sign in the yard. There might be certain instances where a sign would not be warranted. So just kind of keep that in mind. But for the most part, you want to let those sellers know that, hey, oftentimes I get sign calls from the sign in the yard. So by not having a sign, we're limiting our potential buyer pool to only those who have access to the online world. So we may want to keep that sign in the yard because you never know, somebody might be visiting one of your neighbors, driving by, perusing the neighborhood, see that for sale sign and want to come check out your home. So that gives them the information to call me. Key safe lockbox. Let them know that you're going to install a lockbox on the property. I usually only install the blue Supra iBox and let them know that it's secure, that not anybody can get the combo for it, that they actually have to be a licensed realtor, which means their fingerprints are in the national database. Okay, and then you got additional terms there, which we talked about. You can fill in anything you want there that's not covered above or to clarify information from above. And that's kind of the grid and how it works out. So major change, right? There's no cooperating broker compensation. We're only talking right here about the compensation that we're going to receive for selling this property. Now, when we're having this conversation with our seller about the listing agreement and talking with them about this and letting them know that, hey, I charge X% compensation or professional fee in order to list and sell your house. Here's all the things that I'm going to do for you. However, previously, we used to offer the buyer's agent compensation for bringing a buyer to sell your house. Now, seller, it's not a requirement to do so. However, if we choose not to offer compensation to the buyer's agent of any sort or help cover the buyer's cost of that, the cost for them to be represented, it may limit our buyer pool. And here's why it's important for the buyer to be represented by their own agent. And then I would go into the spiel about the fact that buyer's agency is important because when we have buyers that are not represented, we're going to see more and more lawsuits from that come up because the buyers aren't educated on the process and they're just trying to move through it on their own. And somebody's not helping and supporting them and guiding them through that process. And it's important to have a different agent than myself represent the buyer. And here's the reasons why. So we want to talk about the importance of buyer agency. We want to talk about the importance of why I highly don't recommend dual agency where I represent both the buyer and the seller because all the gray area in there. So we want to have that conversation with our sellers, but they still may want to be, here's the different ways that we may want to see the buyer try to negotiate the cost of their commission being covered by the seller. Anastasia, you had a question.
Yes, ma'am. In the notes, in the private notes on the listing, can we put SPBB will be accepted?
I do not believe because
let
that
them know that will be, you know, that we're entertaining the ideas of compensation.
I would not. Because we're not supposed to put any forms of communication regarding commission in the comments.
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you.
So I liked your sly way of trying to squeeze it in there. And no, I think that violates.
E for effort.
Yeah. Yeah. A plus for, I'd give you an A+ for effort. I thought that was really creative, but no. Okay. All right, so that takes us through, again, the rest of it is just all the details regarding everything we covered. If you've never read through the listing agreement, please take time to do it. It's so important that you understand and know this listing agreement and what's talked about in each of the sections so that you fully understand it. We're going to skip ahead though to the MLSA, which is another one of the new forms that was released. And the reason this form is so important is they took a bunch of stuff out of the listing agreement and they put it in this MLSA. Okay. So, because this is all like MLS specific items that used to be in the listing agreement. Okay. This talks about what is a multiple listing service, right? What information is provided before and after the sale, and what is the broker's MLS. So it goes through all that. It talks about the benefits of using the MLS and the impact of opting out, right? Limiting your buyer pool. It talks about public marketing of the property. Okay, for the most part, most of the MLSs or the Association of Realtors in the area go by the clear cooperation policy, which is within 24 hours of public marketing of the property, right? It tells you right here, public marketing. That property must be in the MLS as active and ready to be seen by prospective buyers. Okay. Barry's does not adhere to the clear cooperation policy. Okay. So Barry's is if the house is located in Marin, Mendocino, Solano, Sonoma, or Napa counties. Okay, there's 5 counties that are primary MLSs, Barry's MLS. If it falls within those 5 counties, we don't necessarily adhere to we aren't required to adhere to the clear cooperation policy, which means we can market the property as coming soon. Okay, we don't have to have it in the MLS. We do have to have a signed listing agreement. We do have to have what's called a SELM form, or seller exclusion from the multiple listing service. So here is seller instructions to buyers. Seller instructs buyer to market the property to the public at the beginning of the listing period. So that was whatever date we put on the listing agreement is the beginning of the listing period. Okay, so remember, if we're signing it today and today's date is on that listing agreement and the seller is instructing us to list the property at the beginning of the listing period, we need to make sure that it's ready to go in the MLS the next day. Okay. Otherwise, seller instructs the broker to begin marketing the property to the public on blank dates. Okay, that would be D2. So let's say that, hey, we're signing the listing agreement today. So the listing agreement's dated today, but we're not actually going on the market until next Wednesday because we want to have photos taken and some pre-listing inspections and disclosures. And we want to go on like professional agents, not just like we're throwing things in the wind. We would check this box here and we would put next Wednesday's date there. Okay. Now, if this date is more than 3 days after the listing agreement is signed or dated, it's active, right? So if the listing agreement's dated today, we're not going on the market till the 2nd. If it's more than 3 days, which this would be, we need that additional SELM form or the exclusion form. If this is within 3 days of the signed listing, so today is the 25th. So if it was like going to go on the market on the 28th, right? 1, 2, 3, then we don't need a SELM form because MLS rules say that it just has to be in the MLS within 3 days of signed listing agreement. Okay. Now the caveat to that is public marketing, right? So we don't want to public market it until that date because that's what keeps us in line with both the clear cooperation policy and the SELM rules. Okay. If we don't know when it's going to go on the market, we don't have a date, we don't want to put a date here on our listing agreement, we can just come down here and say, hey, seller instructs broker to not market the property to the public. And then we'll fill out the SELM form. And then when we're ready to go on the market, we'll come back and do a modification of terms form to say property begin public marketing on X date. Okay. So those are kind of your options there. So you've got one. It's going to go on the market within 24 hours. Unless it's in Barry's, then it doesn't have to be on the market in 24 hours. We just have to have it on within 3 days. We can still market it as a coming soon. Seller instructs broker to begin marketing the property on a specific date, or we're not sure what date that's going to be, would be 3. Okay. Clear cooperation policy does not apply. So if we're going to be in the Barry's service area, we're just going to come down here and check F. It doesn't apply. But keep in mind that if it's going to be F, I'm still going to fill out D up here. A through E. It still says A through E do not apply to this listing. But I'm going to check this box, and if it's not going to go on the market right away, right? It's not going to go in the MLS right away as either a coming soon in the MLS or as an active in the MLS, we're going to have that SELM form filled out. Okay, so if we're going to sit on this for a week or 2 weeks before we get it into the MLS, we want to check this box here for Barry's counties and then fill out the SELM form. So no matter what, we're going to fill out that SELM form if it's not going to be in the MLS right away. All right, MLS data on the internet. This just talks about what's going to pass through to the internet. If there's things here that they want to opt out of, like their full property address being posted to the public, comments and reviews, the automated estimate of value that might show up on some sites, although we don't have complete control over that. You can check this box here. The seller elects to opt out of certain internet features provided by Carform SELI. Okay, and it'll automatically, it didn't automatically attach that form. It should, but you'd have to go find that form and attach it, and then it'll give you the options of what you're electing to do and what you're electing not to do. So that's that C2 button there, is if they want to elect out of any of these. Now, keep in mind that if their property or property address, if the full address is not in the MLS and not showing up as marketed to the public, then it's not going to show up on any of the map searches. So when we go to like Zillow or your realtors or your whatever other internet search, it's not going to show up on the map search. And most buyers are searching properties based on that map search. Okay, so just something to keep in mind there. 5 is seller concessions. Hey, concessions are monetary payments that a seller agrees to contribute toward the buyer's expenses and other costs the buyer is responsible for in the transaction. So this is going to be like, hey, seller, when we remember when I talked about the compensation, my professional fee for services, and how it used to work and how it works now, here's where it talks about that in the form. Are you willing to consider offers asking for concessions? Okay, that doesn't mean that we're agreeing up front to whatever it is that the buyer's agent or the buyer's asking for, whether it be closing costs or asking us to pay for the compensation for their agent or part of that compensation. This is just saying that, hey, yes, I'm willing to consider those type of offers. Are you willing to consider? Yes. Right? Now, I would say it's important as a listing agent that we don't tell prospective buyer's agents what the seller is willing to pay. Because maybe that buyer's agent isn't very good and they only think that their value for their professional service is a lower percentage than what my seller is willing to compensate a buyer's agent. And if I had told the buyer's agent that, yeah, my seller is willing to compensate you with X, and they're like, oh my gosh, that's more than I negotiated with my buyer. I need to go do a modification of terms and change the commission and or the compensation and before I submit this offer so I can get paid more. Well, if we hadn't told them what that percentage was, then the seller may have paid less, right? Or maybe the buyer was willing to cover like half of the compensation that the buyer's agent was asking for. The seller's willing to pay potentially the full amount. And if we don't tell the buyer's agent what the seller is willing to compensate, just that they're willing to compensate and please submit an SPBB form with their offer, then we make sure to protect our seller's interest, because we can always counter offer if they're asking for more than what we're willing to pay, but we're not making our seller potentially liable for more than they would have had to, right? We're helping to save our sellers money. So I'd be careful in letting buyer's agents know a specific commission percentage that our sellers are willing to pay in compensation for concessions. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Okay, this next box here, 6, is photographs, just saying that, hey, people that visit the property may take photographs of the inside or the exterior of your house. We don't have control over that ultimately, but in the MLS, I can post a little thing saying that MLS taking photos is limited to the person preparing appraisal or inspection reports only, hoping that people aren't taking pictures. Again, we can't control it, but if that's the seller's wishes, we can check that box there. Okay, so that's the MLSA addendum. Okay, that covers kind of all the little caveats that should have been included, that used to be included in the purchase agreement that are now in an addendum because it all applies to the MLS. Any questions about that form? All right, keep in mind too that again, we have that broker compensation advisory, the BCA form. We'll see that on both the listing agreement and the purchase agreement. This one might be important. It's tucked at the end. I almost feel like maybe it should be at the beginning because it just talks about, hey, listing agreement, compensation's fully negotiable, right? Optional compensation if buyer is unrepresented, right? If we'd covered this up front, we didn't really need to have a full conversation about it in the middle of that grid. And then broker may represent both buyer and seller in dual agency. And that's just saying that, hey, if we do, I'm negotiating my commission as the buyer's agent directly with that buyer. It's not part of our agreement. Okay. So that's the portion of the BCA that applies to listings. All the other forms we've talked about already that have changed. Any questions about the residential listing agreement, how to present it to our sellers, the MLSA or the BCA, or anything else before we wrap up today? If you are interested in making suggestions for trainings that you'd like to see coming up either in December or at the beginning of next year, there is a link in the chat box where you can click on and make suggestions for trainings that you'd like to see. We'll continue on with our Rev Up training tomorrow at, I don't know what time, 10 o'clock, I want to say. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it's tomorrow at 10 o'clock. We're going to talk about lead generation. So if you need to generate more leads, we'll be talking about some different ways to do that, the appropriate ways to do that, how to follow up with those, sign calls and different things as well. So lead generation tomorrow morning for Rev Up. Any questions before I sign off?
Thank you, Amy.
You're welcome.
Have a great day.
All right, you guys too.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
You're welcome, Iris.